Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. Know thy enemy and know thy enemy's master. I think these are the two things which are going to be the bottom line of our conversation today. As you can see, I have with me Air Marshal Anil Chopra, PVSM, AVSM, VM, VSM, a fighter pilot, a test pilot, and a retired Air Marshal, as I mentioned, from the Indian Air Force, a pioneer of the Mirage 2000 fleet. He has today over 400 articles published about air power strategy and many a topic on the geopolitical arena. Currently, he's the Director General for the Center of Air Power Studies. Thank you, sir, for joining me today to understand India's nemesis number one, the Chinese President Xi Jinping.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Adi. This is the third time that we are interacting, and every time we have a new subject of global importance. And I'm very happy to be back with you today. Thank you. Thank you for inviting. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Sir, as I mentioned, know thy enemy. And the Chinese state, of course, is a large state to understand in terms of his army, in terms of his policies, and so on and so forth. But the bottom line, when I, first discussed this with you, I begun to realize that the bottom line is Xi Jinping, because it's also his personal rush, his personal motivation, whatever you may want to call it, and or ambition for that matter. How do you generally observe who is Xi Jinping, sir?
General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Chairman of the Central Military Commission, the President of People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping is currently the paramount leader of China. The very authoritarian. Xi is considered more like a dictator. He's built a cult-like personality to exercise greater hold of the party. He has tried to quell and finish dissent or even mild opposition. He's also tried to rein in possible power blocks. He has used his entire state machinery for censorship and mass surveillance. And to stay in power for indefinite periods, he had extended the existing term limit that has been there for being the president. And like all powerful chairmen, now he has had his political thoughts and approach embedded in the party thinking. He directly controls all the instruments of power, including national security, military, economy, and social reforms. He's thus, as the Americans call him, chairman of all things. He has followed a very assertive foreign policy. Some of his signature campaigns have been claiming of most of the South China Sea and the Belt and Road Initiative to extend China's influence to Eurasia and Africa. And internally, he has used every means to consolidate his position, more prominent being the anti-corruption campaign to rein in the corrupt and especially the opponents. He's clearly a man in a hurry to make China a superpower. In June last year, China introduced the national security law in Hong Kong to curb the democratic movement and protests to integrate it fully with the communist China. His most important unfinished agenda remains annexation of unification of Taiwan with the mainland China. And you won't believe it, day before was PLA's anniversary, 72nd anniversary. They made a large number of sorties into Taiwan, and the day that is the next day again they followed it up with similar numbers, nearly 70 sorties in 2 days. So that is the kind of aggression with which he is operating. Yes.
Interesting, sir. One would actually learn a lot by his early life. Where did he, get his mindset actually fixed up? That should tell you what he's doing today. So why don't you tell us a little bit about his early life, sir?
Yeah, I have studied this man very, very closely, and that is why we are perhaps having this interaction. And Xi Jinping was born in Beijing in June 1953, the same year that I was born. So we are practically at the same age group. He was the second son in a family. He had a communist lineage. That is, his folks were also communists. He tried joining the CCP at a very young age, when he was just 10. but his father was purged from the party because the communists didn't like him. Z's secondary education was cut short by Cultural Revolution. Z's sister committed suicide. His mother publicly denounced his father when he was labeled as an enemy of the revolution. His father was sent to prison in 1968 and he never saw him after that. He was forced to work in the villages but was unable to withstand the hard rural life and he escaped to Beijing. But in communist China, nobody can escape. He was arrested and then sent to work in a camp where he was made to dig ditches. Later, worked in a village for 7 years. Clearly, had a tough and at times humiliating childhood. And after being repeatedly rejected, he managed to finally join the Communist Youth League in 1971 by enticing some local officials. Similarly, after being rejected many times, he managed to finally join the Communist Party in 1974. He enrolled simultaneously for chemical engineering course in Beijing under worker, peasant, soldier, not by selection. There's a special quota for people who are worker, peasant, soldiers. A significant time of the course is devoted to teaching about Marx, Lenin, and Mao Zedong, their thoughts, and doing field work with People Liberation Army. So Xi's first exposure to political work was as the secretary to the vice premier Gang Gu, who was also the Secretary General of the CMC, the China Military Commission. In 1985, he went to USA as a part of a delegation to study US agriculture. And there he stayed with an American family. This 2-week stay left a lasting impression on him. He served in various political posts in the coming years. And in between, he studied the Marxist theory of and the ideology related education, graduating with a doctorate in law and ideology. Now, Xi was the governor of Fujian, not very far from the coast facing Taiwan, and in 2002 was elected full member of the Central Committee, bringing him to the national stage for the first time. His political career was marked by tough stance against corrupt officials, and this was watched closely by public and the party leadership. And later he was made governor and a party secretary in Zhejiang, a province in East China looking towards Japan. In 2007, he was elevated to the party secretary of Shanghai and became a member of the CCP Politburo Standing Committee. And in March 2008, Xi was elected as the vice president of PRC and vice chairman of CMC. You see how he has been rising. He was also appointed the president of Central Party School of the Communist Party. And after the global financial crisis of 2008, Xi visited many countries to promote Chinese trade ties. He visited United States. He also met then US President Barack Obama at the White House, and then also the President, then Vice President Joe Biden. And in November 2012, Xi was finally elected to the post of General Secretary of the Communist Party and the chairman of CMC. And he's the first General Secretary born after the formation of PRC in 1949. And Xi has gone through many trials and tribulations. You can see his childhood. And in his first speech as General Secretary, he spoke of the aspirations of the ordinary people. He talked about better education, jobs, income, social security, healthcare, and better living conditions. He also spelled out the need to take on the corrupt at the highest levels, and further economic reform and strengthening military was his most important agendas. He was finally elected president on 16 March 2013, and then he became chairman of all things. Great youth, but tough one.
I know, sir, and it's like a ladder straight going up, and that's what you see. He's had his struggles. Probably a couple of reins of the ladder were broken, but it's a ladder that's straight gone up. So you mentioned his anti-corruption drive, and he seems to be very passionate about it within his country, and not even sparing people very close to him. And there's also another term which is kind of coming out pretty a lot, which is common prosperity. Previously, yes, people knew about it, but nowadays you can see a lot more discussion on this particular subject. What do you say about
Yeah.
these two things, sir?
As I said, that in his initial political rise, Z had decided to crack down on corruption. He issued 8-point guideline after he came into power to arrest corruption and discipline the party officials. They cracked down on both the tigers and flies, and that's what he used to call, implying that the powerful leaders and lowly bureaucrats. He created central investigation teams and anti-corruption agency and began legal proceedings and criminal cases against many of the senior corrupt functionaries. Many high-ranking officials and military officers were implicated. Few 100,000 low functionaries were given written warnings or fines or demotions, or some were, of course, arrested. Some felt it was more like a political purge. A National Supervision Commission was set up and was given a status higher than the Chinese Supreme Court. Now, this is something even the Amnesty International felt that this is a clear situation for a threat to human rights. Now, within a year after coming to power, that is in 2013, Z circulated party document number 9, which forbade intellectuals, particularly college instructors, from talking on universal values, talking about media freedom, talking about civil society, civil rights, and even talking about any aberrations in the party's history. Now, the document cautioned against Western values. He staunchly, this communist and autocratic Z that he was, did not want the Chinese talking about constitutional democracy. He didn't want them to talk about judicial independence, about universal rights, about individual rights, about morality, about human endeavor. He didn't want words like pro-market globalization, media independence. He wouldn't like anybody to question the Chinese style of socialism. Now, these subjects were forbidden to be covered in any educational material. International and internet censorship was on the rise. He took a very strong stand to control internet usage inside China. Google, Facebook, Twitter are all still blocked in China due to the country's great firewall to safeguard the internet sovereignty. Even Wikipedia stands blocked. They have Weibo, which is a Chinese micro-blogging website. It's one of the biggest social media platforms in China. They've had this since 2009. And the interactions on the web sites are closely monitored by the Communist Party, and any defamatory comments could invite prison. Now, most of Chinese avoid controversial or critical comments. The telecommunications operators were asked to block the individuals using virtual private networks, that is VPNs, and comparisons between Z and the Disney character Winnie the Pooh were banned. We all have seen the cartoons about the two. Yes.
And that is, I mean, that's quite sensitive, as a matter of fact, banning a cartoon. I mean, a lot of us would take it as a joke and laugh about it, but it got pretty serious within China at one point of time, and there was a crackdown of sorts which was done. That I mean, it's something that you brought out very nicely, sir. Thank you. So his centralization of power, you said that the Americans call him chairman of all things. There has to be a reason for that. First, how did he do it and why?
Yeah, for anybody to become a supreme leader in any country, certainly in China, which is a closed society, you have to consolidate power. Z clearly consolidated power and became the most powerful leader since Chairman Mao Zedong. Practically, he has done away with the collective leadership that was being practiced for a long time. Especially Deng used to talk about it. The maximum two-term restriction for presidency has been done away with since March 2018. The logic used was that if General Secretary of the CCP and the Chairman of the Military Commission have no term limits, then why have limits for the President? He de facto exercises direct institutional control over the party, the military, the internal security, economy, and in many cases bypasses all existing institutions. He has literally got all the blue-eyed boys from his earlier tenures in the districts and provinces, and he is put them into important positions. He also tried to build a cult personality for himself. He is often referred to as Z Dada. This is not a Hindi word. Z Dada in Chinese means Big Daddy. Though one is not very sure it is in awe or in fear. While his predecessors opened up control over the economy and that resulted in over 10% annual growth, Xi actually increased state control over China's economy while allowing private sector to continue, albeit within the party dictated norms. He ensured a greater support for state-owned enterprises. Rather than allowing the private sector more space, he wants them to be a tool for implementation of the government policies. He's also been working closely to increase the global role for the Chinese currency. We all know the yuan currently accounts, yuan currently accounts only for about 2% of the global foreign exchange reserves, but could go up to 5 to 10% if he continues to push by 2030. Now, Xi wants the reforms, but don't take China or its government for granted is his way of conveying to his businessmen. Since Trump administration imposed economic sanctions, he tried to push self-reliance, especially in high technology areas. And China unveiled plans to boost spending and research on cutting-edge chips and artificial intelligence in a bid to achieve major breakthroughs in some of these core technologies. But simultaneously, he chose to convey his strength to the private business community in 2020 when Jack Ma, we all know, made an adverse comment on Chinese banking regulatory systems. Angry Xi stopped Ant Group's IPO and cracked a whip on Chinese high-tech businesses to curtail their monopoly, something which is still going on. And in 2021, Beijing issued new industrial regulation covering the big tech to private education just a few days earlier. This tighter government control of the tech-driven economy could have long-term adverse consequences for them, but that's the way Xi wants to function. And when Xi began his second term in 2013, he identified China's key problems as unbalanced and inadequate development and decided to fix it by halting the source that is creating inequality, and that, as per him, is the Chinese business people. Yes,
equalizing of wealth. That's a good old communist sort of a.
yes.
I don't know, the rule or policy or what you want to call it, and it's something that we've seen happening all around the place. So one of the biggest mistakes that people call in Chinese history is the one child policy. Also, Xi is now changed it here and there and stuff like that, but that is termed as a big mistake for the Chinese. And of course, how is he actually changing all these laws and pushing in for legal reforms as well on the side? So what is the significance of that, sir?
When Xi took over very early in 2014, Xi began the legal reform process. He also initiated the military reforms, essentially to reinforce Chinese socialistic rule of law. Effectively, it is an instrument use of laws by rulers to facilitate social control and to impose punishment. So reforms were meant to deliver justice that had been ridden by local government interference, corruption, and lack of constitutional oversight. Effectively, it meant centralizing the system under the garb of transparency and professionalization of legal force. Now, cross-jurisdictional circuit legal tribunals were introduced as a check and balance. Now, more power for the party, less everyday arbitrariness was his aim, and the law is meant to support peaceful reunification and against aspirations of independence. That means, whom I'm hinting at. Surely, this is fueling speculation about the Taiwan-specific anti-secession law, and they are talking indirectly to telling the Tibetans and the people, Uyghurs in Xinjiang, these laws are meant actually primarily for them. Now, the second point you mentioned about China's one-child policy, which began in 1979 to control the rapidly growing population. Very, very clearly a bad decision. It has come out very, very clearly. In mid-1980s, it was modified to allow rural parents to have a second child. if the first one was a daughter. The policy was enforced through a financial penalty in the form of social child raising fee. You know, I have been to China, and if you had wanted to have a second child, you have to make a deposit of 100,000 yuan to the government for social security purposes. You know, there were very significant demographic impact of this policy over nearly half a century. It also began impacting economy with the older profile of the population. And China finally shifted to a two-child policy in 2016. But even this has failed to bring the upsurge in births. As the cost of raising a child in cities become a deterrent. And after the latest census showed continued decline, China announced that it will allow couples to have a third child. It would have been best not to have such restrictions to begin with, which now they are going to repent. Yes.
As a matter of fact, yes, sir, because a lot of people are now saying that the population is lower than India, but the Chinese will never accept it. Sir, you mentioned the military reforms. How are they significant? And the biggest thing for a conscript army, do you think he'll be able to achieve his aim?
No, there are two aspects to the military reforms. Actually, military reforms in some ways was required. As you all know, that we in India are also trying to have military reforms. There were two aspects. One was to cut the army to size. You know, having a 2.3 million army, which was considered too much. So he brought in these, Xi brought these reforms to cut army to size, and he was clear that for global projection, you need the Air Force and the Navy, which need to be brought up. So this is broadly how he started reforms. He directly oversaw the reforms himself as the chairman of the CMC, and he was also the head of military reforms committee. He made it clear to the top military officers that the party has absolute control over the army. Reducing party hold over military would result in organizational collapse like the Soviet Union, he felt. So to reduce the cost and modernize the military, PLA strength was initially cut down from 2.3 million to 2 million. This was not the first time the troops had been cut. PLA had earlier cut 4 times. In 1985, they cut by 500,000. In 97, they cut by 200,000. And again in 2003, they had made a cut. So country has been now divided into 5 theatre commands. We all know 4 autonomous general departments have been expanded to 15 entities, and they all report directly to CMC, of which he himself is the boss. And the strategic support and joint logistic support force have also been created. And in April 2016, Xi was named the commander-in-chief. A clear politico-military statement of power. It's the first time somebody is being, named a commander-in-chief. A commander in war or peace. That is what the word the Communist Party uses. The military reforms were unprecedented in scale and scope and ambition. And the key reform drivers were a major overall for efficiency, building a joint force, modernization, integrating with the society, and most importantly, bringing the military totally under the control of the Communist Party and Xi himself. Yes.
That also shows you some sort of a scare with which he would have had about the military as well, sir. Interesting. Sir, one of the biggest things that has been touted around the world today, and the Quad is scrambling to kind of counter that, is the Belt and Road Initiative. It's like, these veins of roads and, sea lines of communication all across the world, which is basically showing a one grip point, which is coming straight to China. What would you say about that, sir?
Yeah, the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, is Xi's signature, program. In fact, other than military modernization, this one and South China Sea, these are the 3 things where he's made absolute global impact. He started this immediately after he took part. In fact, in the first year itself, launching it in September 2013 during his visit to Kazakhstan, and he called it a golden opportunity. BRI, that is being touted as the ancient Silk Road, is meant to build massive infrastructure projects taking roads, rail lines, and sea routes connecting China to East Asia, to Europe and also to Africa. The economic model is through relatively cheaper yet significant interest loans. USA or any other country does not have any competing project of that kind of vision. See, the projects have been facing resistance in many countries due to the mounting debt and the ensuing arm twisting by the Chinese. Also, all these projects ultimately benefit the Chinese. Why? Because they are Chinese contractors who, by design, are the only ones who can execute these. And Chinese paramilitary provides security to these projects, resulting in further Chinese footfalls. And many projects have been cancelled or put on hold by recipient countries later. And further, BRI has been added to the CCP, the Communist Party's constitution in 2017, thus making it permanent. Even if some other president was to come, it is part of the Communist Party, constitution, and therefore Belt and Road is a big thing. Later, if we get a chance, we will speak about the CPEC, that is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which actually has strategic implications for us. Yes,
Absolutely, yes. It goes through our land. One of the biggest things that hinders China in its interaction with the international world is human rights, and we saw this getting trampled across in Hong Kong, and we are now seeing slow and steady happening to Macau as well, with the ban of gambling and so on and so forth. How do you see this, sir?
yeah. Before I talk about Macau and Hong Kong, the general area of the Western Pacific, called the South China Sea, which is Xi has been pushing the territorial expansionist work in South China Sea. Several countries have made competing territorial claims. The Chinese under Xi have claimed close to 3 million square kilometers of sea as theirs. Now, several countries have been questioning, but they are all small ASEAN countries. These disputes are potential flashing points. China claims that the entire South China Sea as their own by drawing and demarcating something very famously called the nine-dashed line. They've drawn a line to say all these are historically our area. China's claims overlap absolutely with every other country in the region. Some of the more prominent disputes are over the Natun Islands with Indonesia and Taiwan, with the Scarborough Shoal with Philippines and Taiwan, with Spratly Island with Vietnam and Taiwan, and Paracel Island with Taiwan and Vietnam. These are some of the disputes. Of course, there are disputes in Gulf of Thailand with Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand and Vietnam. The entire ASEAN is concerned that the disputes may accelerate into armed conflicts. He has accelerated building military assets on even very, very small islands by reclaiming part of the sea. China prefers bilateral discussions, but the Asian countries are too small and at a disadvantage to deal with such a powerful country next to them. And the smaller countries always want multilateral talks. By making such a territorial claim, China has also claimed a large exclusive economic zone. China has also claimed a large air defense identification zone, which have serious security and economic implications. The USA has accused China of arm twisting the smaller countries in the neighborhood. There have been some show of force incidents between the neighboring navies, but most countries, including many from Asia and Europe, have been insisting on freedom of navigation operations and the right of passage in accordance with the accepted principles of international law, which are included in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. The statement issued after the virtual ASEAN summit in June 2020 last year said that UNCLOS is the basis for determining maritime entitlements, sovereign rights, jurisdiction, and legitimate interests over maritime zones. But China has been seen to be flexing the military muscle in the region. In January 2013, Philippines had formally initiated arbitration proceedings against China's claims. And finally, in July 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration backed the Philippines case and says that there was no evidence that China had historically exercised exclusive control over the waters or resources. So Xi's China, unfortunately, rejected the ruling, calling it ill-founded. The US has been working with regional allies to act as a stabilizing force in Southeast Asia. New alliances have come up, Quad is coming up, some other trilaterals, including the recent one between USA, Australia, and UK. This has heightened tensions with China, who till now was getting away with whatever they wanted to do. You asked about Hong Kong and Macau. Now let me come to this and also the other human rights issues, because this Hong Kong and Macau were supposed to have a dual system of governance. Early enough, Xi decided to rule with the iron hand. Now some of the actions he has even overshadowed what happened in Tiananmen Square, that massacre that happened. He launched an aggressive campaign against activists. The campaign was called 709 Crackdown. I don't know how the Soviets and the Chinese communists have been using some numbers for everything they do. It began in 2015 and still going on, this crackdown. Many lawyers, human rights activists were detained. So have been Chinese women rights and labor rights activists. Being a closed society, the outside world hardly came to know about what was going on. In 2017, many Chinese provinces asked the Christians to replace pictures of Jesus Christ and replace it with who? Xi Jinping's picture.
How?
I believe a party instead of religion was the theme that was set. Some pastors have alleged that it involved destroying crosses, burning Bibles, shutting churches, ordering followers to sign papers renouncing their faith. Xi also launched a strike hard campaign against violent terrorism in Xi Jinping in Xinjiang in 2014. It involved mass detentions, surveillance of ethnic Uyghurs. He personally visited Xinjiang in early 2014. Over 1 million Uyghurs are held in the so-called re-education camps, which have living conditions worse than the concentration camps that were there, in Europe, to forcefully convert the local Muslims to Han way of thinking. The famous Maoist term, people's democratic dictatorship. This is what he called. It's the dualistic policy that means short, painful intervention treatment has to be given to achieve your final goals. And despite the UN Human Rights Commission's intervention, nothing seems to have changed. Forced labor camps continue. Xi Jinping has called for synthesization of Tibet. That is another human rights issue. This involves Buddhism with Chinese characteristics. You see, political and ideological education of Tibetans is going on. And of course, impregnable fortress around Tibet has been created to dissuade against separatist ideas. Now, Xi pushed for total integration of Hong Kong and Macau with the mainland China. Hong Kong security law was passed in June 2020, that is last year. It criminalizes any act of secession, subversion, terrorism, or collusion with foreign external forces. Xi supported stern action by the Hong Kong police to enforce the law, and Xi also warned of the foreign forces interfering in Hong Kong and Macau. The law effectively puts an end to the one country, two system understanding that the rest of the world had with China, especially on Hong Kong. Yes.
Bold moves, sir. Very bold moves, one must say. It's quite a surprise. Sir, one of the things that you've been touching upon within the conversation that we've had is he's got a dream for China. I'd like to add here, might that dream also include him being part of a China that may not be a superpower, then not being part of a China that will be a superpower by the activities that you see currently?
Yeah, see, I will tell you, Xi has, Xi has been using a term called Xi's thought. What is it? Well, Xi and the Communist Party ideologues coined the phrase Chinese dream. term Z used first time in November 2012 when he got elected. It was meant to achieve great rejuvenation of Chinese nation. Since then, it has become the political slogan of Z era. In October 2017, Z outlined his political plan for next 30 years. That means up to 2050. It is officially called Xi Jinping's thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. Its core goal is to restore the country to its past glory through economic prosperity and make China a respected world power. It emphasizes Xi's leadership of the party and the importance of strengthening its rule over all aspects of Chinese society. Reliance on traditional Chinese political thought, culture, practice was important. The 19th Party Congress approved the incorporation of Xi Jinping thought into the constitution of the Communist Party. The Xi Jinping thought has become the most popular smartphone app in China, meant to regularly remind and educate the cadres of the political doctrine of Xi in turn of China. Now, in July 2021, when the 100th anniversary of founding of the Communist Party, Xi further endorsed his views on strengthening the Communist Party. He praised the 95 million members of Communist Party and said never had the party been able to unify the people as they have been unified now under Xi, and that the Communist Party must keep hold over the people. He urged the Chinese diaspora to serve the goals of the Communist Party, and for Xi, nationalism means supporting Communist Party, not supporting China. This is the difference. So strong authoritarian government is an integral part of the Chinese model. And one of the drives being run by Xi is the Common Prosperity Campaign, socialism requiring balancing growth and financial stability and to bring equal income distribution across different regions and the different strata of population. And it is meant to reduce the rich-poor divide. Xi has made revisions to reform era. Chief architect Deng Xiaoping's philosophy. Deng Xiaoping had said that to get rich is glorious, but that's not what Xi feels. There have been crackdowns on businesses and individuals. Their terms being used is reasonably adjusting excess incomes and encouraging high-income individuals and businesses to give back more to society. We can we can allow some people to get rich first, and then guide and help them to make others rich. This is what is his theme. Many policymakers, investors, journalists have been targeted. Mostly, they were the ones who were basically not towing the Xi line. Xi is using the pretext of common prosperity to impose tighter party control, essentially over the nation's super rich private enterprises. You won't believe it, over $1 trillion market value of China's listed firms was wiped out by this Xi drive, this single Xi drive of common prosperity, and the numbers are going up. And domestically, Xi realizes that China's miracle is coming to an end. China's growth has slowed down in recent years. The urban unemployment rate is very high, it's over 15%, and it is causing instability. China's absolute per capita income is around 10,000 US dollars. Even in PPP terms, it's around 17,000 US dollars. When you compare this with America's USA's 63,000 US dollars. So it's more than 4 times bigger even to the PPP. So the Common Prosperity Pilot Program demonstrates the party's states' inability to realize successful socio-economic models for common prosperity, and Xi has simultaneously cracked down on nations' charities also, because they feel that the charities are also being, trying to manipulate the society. So I think that sums up where Xi is trying to take the economy and how he is trying to, rip apart his opposition. Yes.
That's a bit scary, sir, for a country to literally put his entire future down the line for firmer grip. And you basically told me what I said about the superpower thing is absolutely correct. So that's a bit scary for a situation to be. So I'd like to move forward. One of the biggest chinks in his armor is the COVID-19 cover-up. And
Yes.
the viral politic that is actually ensued after that. Currently, of course, it is on the mellow side, but it's like a wave of this virus. It will come up and then go down, and come up and go down. How do you see this going forward, sir?
Yeah, as Trump used to call it, this is China virus. Of course, Trump was a different kind of a person.
Read
Media
altogether.
report said that in January 2020, Xi Jinping spoke on the phone with the WHO, World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom, to delay the global warning that WHO was to issue about the coronavirus outlook, and hold back the information that human to human transmission of the virus was possible. Now, this whole thing got leaked, who, of course, immediately denied allegations. But the US President Donald Trump repeatedly accused the WHO of becoming the tool of Chinese propaganda. He also moved to halt the US aid to the organization. We all know that. Of course, perhaps that was a bit too much. Later, the Chinese billionaire Ren Ziqing was jailed for 18 years for criticizing Xi Jinping's COVID-19 response. Although the charge was for corruption, but actually that was the reason why he was, there.
Brought in.
I must also mention that, this COVID-19 has such a large populous country, large number of people, especially the factory workers living like sardines in small ghettos. For China not to have had a large number of deaths is questionable, because the whole world, including America, Europe, Brazil, India, they all had large number of deaths. So there is surely some kind of a cover-up that Xi Jinping has done on COVID-19, and the drug and all came out much later. So I think that there is so much to, one day more truths will come out perhaps on COVID-19, yes.
A lot of people say they've got an antidote, like those good old movies. But anyway, so that's something that we'll have to try and see.
Yes.
So Xi has been, advocating something called the Wolf Warrior diplomacy, and that's something that we have also seen in his personal interactions with international parties. How do you see his approach towards this thing, sir?
Yeah, for any leader to become big, one of the most important thing is how he handles the world affairs. Like the militaries, he also has a hardline approach on foreign affairs. Because clearly, he has a clear nationalistic agenda, forcefully wanting to assert China's influence on the international stage. He has picked fights with many of his neighbors. We all know what we are going through in India. He's antagonized others. He is impatient with the status quo. He displays high tolerance for risk. He wants to make China united and confident when asserting externally. But often these foreign policy signals are difficult. They've been difficult to read. And they have not necessarily always been very good. Beijing has interest in denuclearization of North Korea, yet they have been giving the mixed signals on that. Xi was very concerned when the third air defense system came on the soil on South Korea, but yet he's been making efforts to get closer to South Korea to improve relations. Meanwhile, Japan finds Xi's aggressive actions in South China Sea and East China Sea as a thing of worry. Japan is concerned about possible forced takeover of the Senkaku Islands. Also, China's promulgation of the ADIZ in November 2013 covers some of the islands which are otherwise of the Chinese. Xi and the Japanese prime ministers have met repeatedly in different forums, different places. While there have been increasing dislike and hatred among the people on the two sides, very high volume of trade continues between all these countries, whether it's Japan, China, whether it's India, China. China-US trade war remains on. Once the USA and its European allies imposed sanctions against Russia after the Ukraine crisis, Xi found a good opportunity to woo Russia. Xi built a strong personal relationship with the Russian strongman counterpart Putin. Xi signed the 4 $100 billion gas deal with the Russians, and soon became Russia's largest trading partner. But they are the largest trading partners of most of the countries around the world. They also meet regularly regional groupings like the Shanghai Cooperation, RIC, BRICS, the Putin and G meet. China is also close to Iran after USA imposed sanctions. So more recently, China has been openly offering support to the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, ostensibly to fill the vacuum left by the US withdrawal. Now, on what is more important for the world is the China-US relationship. Xi said in the beginning of his tenure in 2014, if China and United States are on confrontation, it surely spells disaster for both countries and in some ways for the rest of the world. So is what Xi said right in the beginning of his tenure. And he's been very critical of the USA's strategic pivot to Asia or the Indo-Pacific policy or the Quad. He's been very critical for obvious reasons because the Chinese are the targets. But the US finds the Chinese expansionist action in South China Sea its tacit threats for forced unification of Taiwan and the China's Belt and Road Initiative to increase global influence as a threat to its own global position. So both sides are also strengthening military forces in the Western Pacific region. USA has also been critical of Chinese cyber attacks, intellectual property theft. In response, USA has been trying to rally the West and some of the other countries in the region, like the Quad members, in what it calls is a battle between autocracies and democracies. Now, autocracies, of course, the Americans are including the Russians in it. Beijing is now prepared for a period of increased global uncertainty and geopolitical hostility, and the trade war between US and China is likely to intensify further. Xi is also conscious of building his image as a global leader. This is another important thing, as I mentioned. Xi has made state visits to most countries of the world. During Xi's state visit to USA in 2015, he met the chief executives of the America's top 10 technologies company, which on their own have a market value of more than $2.5 trillion. He uses the state-controlled media to build a larger than life image of himself at home and to project himself as a responsible global statesman abroad. Now, this has been accompanied by a resurgence of patriotic nationalism, whipping up the state media with particular focus on Xi as China's strongman, leading some to accuse him of developing a personality cult. Xi has made visits to Africa to get greater acceptance to bring the countries into Chinese fold. Xi has made early state visits to India starting September 2014 itself. In the first year, he made a visit and had one-on-one with the PM Modi again in Wuhan. Later, Xi's visit to Pakistan in April 2015 cleared the way for China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, the flagship of BRI project. Pakistan conferred on him their highest civilian award, the Nishane-Pakistan. He was the guest of honor at the 2015 Moscow Victory Day Parade to mark the 70th anniversary of the victory of World War II. During his visit to UK in 2015, he also visited the Manchester City's Football Academy as a part of his image building across the globe. And in 2017, he became the first paramount Chinese leader to plan to attend the World Economic Forum at Davos, and was a keynote speaker there and promised an economic globalization and climate change. Unfortunately, that is a promise which got left there itself. Later, Xi has also visited the United Nations headquarters, the World Health Organization, he's been with the International Olympic Committee, all this to showcase his global image and responsibilities. Xi also became the first Chinese leader to visit Japan since 2010 when he attended the G20 summit at Osaka in June 2019. So this is how he's been trying to build, his image and global relations. Yes.
One of the next chinks in his armor is the unification of Taiwan, and that big question, sir. So a lot of people say if they've not been able to do it for 70 years, will they be able to do it now?
Yeah, the first Taiwanese president, Ma Ying-jeou, Xi met in 2015. He was the first one after Xi took over. And Xi said that China and Taiwan are one family and they can't be pulled apart. No force can pull us apart because we are brothers who are still connected by our flesh, even if our bones are currently broken. We are a family in which blood is thicker than water. This is what Xi said. But in 2016, President Tsai Ing-wen, she came and she won with a clear sweeping majority, and she is the pro-independence party leader, the Democratic Progressive Party. Therefore, during the 19th party, now Xi realized that, my God, these guys have taken over Taiwan and they are pro-independence. And therefore, during the 19th Party Congress in 2017, he mentioned that Taiwan and unification using a little stronger language, he said, and later again in 2018, he warned Taiwan will face punishment of history for separatism. And his warnings from 2007 onwards have been increasing. And in January 2019, he said Taiwan's unification with China is inevitable and warned that Beijing reserved the right to use military force to bring it into its fold. He also said that they are willing to create a broad space for peaceful reunification, but will leave no room for any form of separatist activities. Now, the Taiwanese President Tsai retorted that Taiwan would not accept the one country, two system scheme. China has been making aggressive aircraft and maritime forays to threaten Taiwan since then, and a number of incidents are taking place every other day, as far as Taiwan is concerned. When will this happen? Most analysts in the world are saying that it will not happen for next 3-4 years, but you never know when he will bring such a surprise. Yes,
Absolutely. So that's unpredictable, actually. So one of the biggest things that people talk about is, why don't we, okay, let me rephrase that. Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. So a lot of people actually say, why don't we put out the red carpet for the Chinese to actually go inside, let them learn a lesson? What do you say for that, sir?
Yeah, you see how when Americans had trouble with Iran, the Chinese tried to get inside. Now, when Afghanistan, the Americans have walked out. Just remember that till today, the Chinese have not recognized the Taliban government because they know the history is not been favorable. The great empires have the British, the Russians, and then the as you said correctly, graveyard of empires have lost. The Americans have lost, and also the Taliban are not easy people to handle. For them, the religion, terrorism, etc., their ways of working. China is very worried that if they bring a revolution towards Xinjiang, they will be in trouble. So China has also treating with great care, and many Chinese analysts are saying, be careful. China has offered $31 billion emergency aid to Afghanistan, which has not physically reached, but would essentially include only food supplies and the coronavirus vaccines. This is also a Chinese way of engaging the Taliban. Like all other nations, formation of a new interim government was a necessary step to restore order in Afghanistan. Even China feels so. China is also trying to closely coordinate with other neighbors, Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. Meanwhile, China has been critical of USA's handling of Afghanistan and for creating the mess that they did. What the US did in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades is a textbook example which shows us the consequences of wanton military intervention when attempts to impose one's own ideology and values on others, said the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman. So Afghanistan would become a key player in expanding Xi's flagship PRI. Now that is where Afghanistan is of interest to them. Also, keeping control of Afghanistan would help China secure its own provinces, Xinjiang region in particular. from any external intervention. China is also looking at exploring wealth of minerals residing in Afghanistan, which most people don't even know where are they. But these guys wanted China's success in Afghanistan would not only embarrass USA but also increase China's global standing and reach. So that is the kind of interest these people have in there. Yes.
It's a tough road in Afghanistan, sir, but Chinese have been unpredictable. So, with regards to his personal life, of course, we know about his wife, we know about his daughter, not much, but of course, there is news about it. He's got a very strong public image within China where he controls what people know about him and what people see about him. As you mentioned, that the arrests of his family and all that stuff would not be known by the average Chinese. How do you see that entire thing playing out, sir?
In the beginning, I briefly mentioned to you about his youth, the difficult times he had with his parents. But now let's talk about the subsequent family of his personal life. He married Qi Lingling, the daughter of Chinese ambassador to UK in 1979. But the two were said to be fighting almost every day. And after 3 years of married life, they divorced, and she migrated to UK and lives there in UK. So then thereafter, she married his second wife, Peng Liyuan, who's a glamour queen. She is a singer whose marriage is often showcased as the ideal one in propaganda songs in China. There is a song called Papa Z Loves Mama Peng. This was supposed to advertise an ideal Chinese couple for billions of couples who are told to have not more than one single child. So now, unlike many of her predecessors, first ladies, Peng has maintained high visibility. Zi's daughter, Zi Mingzi, their daughter is a graduate from Harvard University. Members of Zi's extended family are all having substantial business interests. But once he came into power and started the anti-corruption campaign, they all have been, asked to rein in, move back a little, and go underground. Zi was considered supremely pragmatic, a realist with his eyes on the prize from his early adulthood, a down-to-earth, cautious, and hardworking person. There aren't many 21st century leaders who have lived in a cave and labored as a farmer before coming to power. So that way we must grant him that. He is known to enjoy American films. One of his favorite films is supposed to be Godfather. He likes playing football, climbing mountains. That means physical activity. But that's also because he wants to showcase. We all know Putin regularly showcases his muscles and by doing some adventure activities. He has very high public rating in China, the highest that anybody has ever had. And in 2018, Forbes ranked him as the most powerful and influential leader in the world. He was also the fourth Chinese to be honored with Pakistan's highest civilian award, which I already mentioned. So that is something about his personal life, yes.
He keeps that same image, I must say, within his personal life as well, sir. And, just to end up, of course, a lot of the viewers would be interesting. Okay, we've now understood who Mr. Jinping or Xi is. What are his plans and what are the implications of a powerful Xi in China for India?
Yeah, before I talk of the implications for India, which is our main, I think should be how we should wrap up this whole interaction. I want to very briefly talk about the Xi-Modi equation because both are powerful leaders in their own countries, and that will bring us to what the implications are. Now, PM Modi made a great start in 2014. He had this neighborhood first policy. Modi did personal rapport with Xi. They both leaders had come up more or less same time within a year and a half of each other. In 2014, Xi arrived for a 3-day visit. That means in the first few months of Modi's tenure, 3-day visit. And the red carpet was rolled out in Modi's home state, Gujarat, and at Ahmedabad, we all saw them sitting on the ground. Modi's first visit to China was in May 2015, and Xi also received Modi in his own hometown of Xi'an. Very interesting. So the next one-to-one, of course, happened in Wuhan in April 2018. There were many optics of Modi Xi summit meeting in near Chennai in Mablapuram in 2019. Unprecedented camaraderie was visible between the leaders of the world's most populous two nations, despite having boundary disputes. Modi visited many other, Chinese cities. He had gone there for G20 summit. He had also gone for the BRICS summit. He also went to China for the Shanghai Cooperation Summit. Effectively, Modi met Xi around 18 times after becoming a prime minister in 2014. Modi is the only Indian PM who has made 9 official visits to China, 5 as the prime minister and 4 times as chief minister of the, when he was chief minister of Gujarat. Now, he did invest significant personal capital with Xi. Modi and Xi had agreed to maintain peace and tranquility between the two countries. China has been concerned about India's participation in the so-called anti-China Quad grouping. Xi perhaps wanted to give a signal to India, and that's and perhaps to, as some say, he was trying to put India in place, and that's how Galwan happened. The Chinese inclusions and actions in Eastern Ladakh in 2020 put Modi-Xi one-to-one equations in cold storage. And in fact, the people in India were so angry that, there is this feeling to get reverse. It may take 8-10 years. But other than this equation, as you rightly said, the more important thing is the implications for India of how Xi is trying to take China to global stage. Xi has continued to push the Chinese initiatives to strengthen their positions in the Indian Ocean region. China has invested more than $100 billion in the economies of Bangladesh, Maldives, Myanmar, Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, which are our immediate neighbors. China is now the largest overseas investor in Maldives, Myanmar, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Chinese investment is mostly in hard infrastructure, power, roads, railways, bridges, ports, airports, most of which have strategic implications. Well, Pakistan remains China's major arms importer, but India's other neighbor, Bangladesh, is the second largest importer of Chinese arms. China has been supporting the governments of Pakistan and Myanmar, who are otherwise under international pressure on terrorism and human rights. Now, China's approach for gaining access to new countries has been through arms sales and, of course, the infra projects. The context clearly specified that the arbitration for any dispute in all these projects will be in China. So, China has covered itself very well. And the loans, as I said, are conditional. The contracts are given only to Chinese companies. China has taken stake in both Karachi and Dhaka stock exchanges. That makes them get deeper into the country's economy. And China has pumped investments in landlocked Nepal and got into their local politics, into the political system to increase influence and have them tilt away from India. Of course, Nepal is doing a balancing act. China has also been using its strength in telecom technology and large-scale production to enter into global markets, especially in Asia and Africa. So they are into networks and system hardware, and this is suspected to be embedded with cyber devices that can have security implication for every recipient country. And therefore, India decided that we will not go, we will have our own 5G systems by our Indian entrepreneurs. China is behaving how emerging superpowers generally tend to behave. They try to flex muscle, project power, and all of which China is trying to do at this moment. Its continued strengthening engagement with Pakistan and deeper forays into these neighboring countries has other implications for India. While the BRI projects are meant to be economic in nature, but as I said, there are military footfalls, and the countries are getting indebted to more powerful China, who then makes inroads into masses, institutions, and actually impacts sovereignty of those countries. And ports, especially like the Gwalior, have a great military potential. The Pakistan-China nexus has much greater implications for India. Both are occupying Indian territory. Both have serious boundary disputes. Both are nuclear. They have commonality in military hardware. They're doing regular joint military exercise between them, increase the threat of the possible two-nation war for India. The number of exercises has increased exponentially. High-level military-to-military visits are also on the increase. China learns Western combat tactics and philosophy from the Pakistanis, who are regularly flying with the Western militaries or doing arming exercises. Pakistan gets to know about some of the Russian platforms like the Su-30 that India operates. The regional comprehensive economic partnership will give Xi greater political and economic control over some of these Asian countries. India has chosen not to be part of it, this arrangement, because we already have one-to-one free trade agreements with practically all the countries which are part of the RCEP. This puts pressure on India to have stronger bilateral trade arrangements, which, as I said, are already in place. These military modernization, which also cements their leadership claim in the region. The world is reacting, the Quad is being strengthened, more trilaterals are coming up. China is pushing multipolarity and ideological plurality. The Communist Party represents China's authoritarian state capitalism, a model that they want to push all over the world. Xi is a man in a hurry. Now, let me just sum up the implication. He has thrown caution to the winds and also thrown Deng Xiaoping's approach of hide your strength and bide your time. Xi will continue to rule as an absolute leader for some more time. Though there are some people asking who next after Xi, India has to contend with rising China and an aggressive Xi. India has to become economically and militarily strong. India cannot expect outsiders to fight our battles. India has to build a strong deterrent so as to prevent Chinese aggressive designs. India has to prepare for a hybrid war. India cannot sit out and watch. India has also to get our politicians united, because right now, for everything the opposition is questioning, because we have to face the Chinese challenge jointly. We have to use diplomacy and to find more free-thinking friends and build alliances. Remember, India has to fight its own battles and handle its own global interests. Surely, let us remember that the elephant may be slow, but the dragon cannot win against the elephant in the end.
Absolutely. Absolutely, sir. That is, I think, the punchline of the game, sir. So this has been a story which actually I don't think a lot of people know about. There are certain very, very interesting features about this man that you've taken us through, because that also tells us why, it explains us why what is happening in China today. His relationship within China seems to be a little strained, so that's why he's probably gaining further and further control over its bodies, and as you've mentioned, from financial institutions to social, beings and socio-economics and a whole lot of things. As a matter of fact, he's controlling now how much video games a child needs to play in a week.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That also,
exercising total control over his people, but by cutting off the people from the rest of the world in the long term, like the Soviet Union time, I'm not sure if it is sustainable. Yes.
So that also kind of gives you a hint that there is some sort of an opposition within China, which Xi is also a little scared of. So that's why he's tightening it as hard as he can so that he can actually keep a firm grip over the country and its activities. He just explains to us why China is the way it is today, and why it is more of a personality-driven game to counter China rather than a country versus a country. And of course, I must say that the Godfather thing rings a bell. Of course, his favorite movie, it rings quite a bell into your head when you actually say something like that. So, thank you so much for putting all this together. This is obviously a very, very informative session, and I wish it reaches the maximum possible people in India so that we understand who this person is, and we unite together the way he's trying to unite his country. We also unite together to counter the threat that this man poses us today. Thank you so much, sir. Till next time for another topic. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Hari. Thank you. Always a pleasure. God bless you. Keep up the great work.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Jai
Jai
Hind.
Hind.